Hello, my name is Felisa Tibbits. I'm UNESCO Chair in Human Rights and Higher Education. I'm delighted that UNESCO invited me to deliver this webinar for you and that you made time to join me today or in the future listening to this recording. Thank you. I'm very honored to hold this chair position, and I'm indebted to Utrecht University in the Netherlands, where I hold the chair in human rights education, for forwarding my application to UNESCO to hold this chair position with them. And I'm also indebted to the benefactors of my chair in Utrecht, the Seroptimists, a women's group dedicated to the rights of women and girls worldwide, and in particular, the benefactor Carla Altsema-Lohman. So many thanks for these institutions and organizations for supporting me. In today's presentation, I want to look sort of widely at human rights in higher education, and the title I've chosen is also the title of a book I'm working on with a colleague from South Africa, Andre Kate. That title is Emancipatory Human Rights in Higher Education, and I guess that kind of says it all. How can human rights as a lens, as a framework, within universities move towards justice and liberation from a value system that's associated with human rights? This, of course, begins with the presumption that the university has a role to play in society. It's not just only preparing students to take their place as workers in society, as qualified workers in society, but also as citizens and as individuals engaged with the constant and dynamic reformation of societies towards a vision that we would like to think, or I'd like to think, would reflect the values of human rights. So as we think about human rights and the prospect it brings as a value system, as a legal system to the university, I think it calls us to look both inside of the university and what's happening within those four walls, like the walls depicted behind me, but also what's happening outside of the university, how it is interacting with partners, with its neighborhood, the neighborhood in which it's based, how students, graduates in the future are being prepared to engage also in society. So it involves looking inside and outside of the university walls. In this webinar today, for the next, say, 30 minutes or so, I would like to explore the implications of using a human rights lens in higher education by applying the frames for quality education that were developed by the first UN Special Rapporteur on the right to education, Katarina Tomaszewski. She developed the 4 R's, which I will share with you as I proceed. And these were actually adopted by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in its General Comment 13 on the right to education. So in order for education to be of high quality, the kinds of criteria that she applied and which I will be using was availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability. These are quite conveniently all beginning with A's, and I will define these and apply these to higher education in my presentation today. So I want to be looking at these 4 dimensions of the quality education in terms of teaching and learning processes in higher education, which might have been the first thing that came to mind to you, but also university-wide policies, practices, and culture. So that's the agenda for my presentation today. I will be offering observations. I will be offering questions when I really don't have any answers myself, but where I do have some recommendations, I'm going to be happy to share those. I hope that you're going to find this interesting and stimulating for your own thinking and practices, and I hope that I will be able to have an interaction with some of you after my presentation today. Let's begin first with the International Human Rights Standards and the university. What do they say? First of all, I maybe should explain for those of you who aren't familiar with human rights law, what we mean by human rights law. There are international and human rights laws that are laid down. If they're coming from the United Nations, they're passed by the General Assembly as a treaty, which means they're potentially legally binding for those governments that basically sign on to them, ratify them, and agree to comply with them. So just like treaties between countries following a conflict are binding, human rights treaties are also binding for those governments that voluntarily sign on to them. And basically these obligations require governments to act in certain ways to promote and to protect human rights and fundamental freedoms of individuals and of groups. In relation to the right to education, which is the rights area clearly related to higher education, we see that those rights are both immediate in terms of being non-discriminatory, that the behaviors of universities should be non-discriminatory, but also the right to education in higher education is progressive in the sense, for example, that education should be affordable. That's considered that principle, of course, is a grounded one, it's a firm one, but the ability of governments to realize that is dependent upon resources. So in that respect, it's considered a progressive right. Governments and their institutions are expected to respect and fulfill these rights as best they can, improving as time passes. That's the progressive element of it. As with other economic, social, and cultural rights, which is what the right to education is considered to be, the full realization of the right to education can be hampered by a lack of resources and can be achieved over a period of time. This is why, as I mentioned, some states' obligations are considered progressive. And this is in relation to not only higher education, but also secondary education. Nevertheless, in terms of their human rights obligations, governments have the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. In respect to the right to education, they have to respect the enjoyment of rights and not interfere with the delivery of the right to education on their territory. They should protect the right to education, meaning that they should not, they should make sure that the right to education is not prevented or impeded in any way. For example, ensuring that parents don't prevent girls from going to school. And the right to education can be fulfilled by governments by adopting appropriate measures towards the full realization of the right to education. For example, ensuring that it's culturally appropriate for minorities and indigenous peoples and has a high quality for all. These are general principles of the right to education. They're not specific at all to higher education. It's generally used in relation to basic education, which is required to be delivered by governments in the Convention of the Rights of the Child, Economic, Social, Cultural Rights Convention, reaffirmed through the Sustainable Development Goals. So, so higher education has an interesting relationship to the right to education as formulated here. On the one hand, let's say that it's part of a kind of understanding that education should, as governments can, be made available and required. So basic education, that's the first 8 years, say, of education. Now governments are required to deliver. It's considered a human right. Through the Sustainable Development Goals, now secondary education is encouraged, and higher education is also something that is encouraged but not required by governments to provide. So, but the importance of non-discrimination is a solid principle, a human rights principle that applies to all levels of education, including higher education. So, in summary, the international standards, any standards related to non-discrimination apply immediately to higher education where it's offered, whether it's a public institution or a private institution. And in terms of making higher education available, and fulfilling the criteria that I'm going to now move into, that's considered to be a progressive right that government should fulfill as soon as possible. It's probably worth mentioning that, you know, we do have more and more young people going into higher education. So I do think that this is an area that the United Nations and regional human rights institutions will need to be grappling with increasingly moving forward. But let's move to the 4 A's and those lenses and what they bring to our, maybe our understanding of human rights in higher education. The first A is available. Education should be free, and there should be an adequate infrastructure. Again, the 4 A's were developed by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, Tomaszewski, and this was in relation to basic education. So what I'm wondering is to what degree this might also apply to higher education. So, education should be free and there should be adequate infrastructure. Again, it's progressive right, the right to education at the higher education level. But as we think about university admission policies, we know that in many cases, maybe all cases, or almost all cases, university has charges. It's not free. We know that the percentage of young people worldwide pursuing higher education is higher than ever. According to the World Bank, it actually doubled. Those numbers doubled between the year 2000 and the year 2014. What those statistics don't show is the disparity in access, as 20% of the richest youth in the world completed at least 4 years of higher education, compared with less than 1% of the poorest. So if we look at the statistics now, for those who are attending higher education, we can already see an incredible disparity between those youth coming from families with means and those coming from families that are poor. So already we see this kind of, in a way, inequality of access based on family resources. So this means that already, without some kind of means for that universities are taking to reduce economic barriers, unless universities or governments try to reduce those costs, those kinds of inequalities are going to continue. And it means for our societies, class reproduction and a lack of social mobility. Therefore, we could argue that already availability through affordability can be seen as a human rights issue in regards to these kinds of reproduction of inequalities. The second A is the A of accessible. The education system, according to Tomaszewski, should be non-discriminatory and positive steps taken to include the most marginalized. This already reverberates back to availability. And of course, these 4 A's, I should mention, are interrelated. So the most marginalized could include those coming from poor backgrounds. But accessibility, certainly, and non-discrimination is a very core principle of higher education. And non-discrimination principles applies to absolutely everyone already in the higher education community. Groups recognized as requiring special attention, of course, depend on the society. For example, we have non-discrimination policies in relation to females, persons with disabilities, perhaps depending on the society and the university, members of the LGBTQI communities, religious minorities. Special attention is already taken by many universities that have policies related to non-discrimination. In the US, we have these policies evolving regularly, and we have in the last 10 years, for example, begun to pay more attention to youth that are coming to universities who are the first in their families to attend college, and recognizing that they have special needs. So it might be in your university, your society also, that there are groups requiring special attention that weren't mentioned in any of the categories I just mentioned to you. We also in The United States, and perhaps in other countries that you know of or are in right now, also have newcomers coming in. Refugees are coming in. You might be you may be in a transition country or a host country. These individuals that have arrived in your society may not hold the credentials that others in your society hold. They may need special attention and support to be able to apply to universities, to be able to attend your universities. So these is another example of a kind of special group that might require active steps in order to be able to be eligible to study at university, given that they have the requisite background to be successful. So in summary, applying a human rights lens through the accessible dimension means that regardless of the special groups identified as requiring special attention, the human rights, the dignity of all should be respected, and active measures should be taken so that they do not feel discrimination when they're a part of the community. In fact, they feel inclusion, but also special steps should be taken at all stages to ensure that the most marginalized groups have the opportunity to participate in higher education. The third lens is one that's called acceptable. According to Tomaszewski, the content of education should be relevant, non-discriminatory, culturally appropriate, and of high quality. I'm going to read this again. The content of education should be relevant, non-discriminatory, culturally appropriate, and of high qualities. This pertains not only to the content of teaching, but all aspects of the university experience. And here I would like to join the human rights lens with that of decoloniality. I consider that both of these approaches are complementary, and they move beyond curriculum and classroom pedagogy, although these are very important to both human rights and decoloniality, but they also pertain to university culture, policies, and practices, both in the classroom, but also in the corridors of the university, and even in partnership with the community. So let me explore this a little bit with you. First of all, if you're not familiar with the decoloniality movement, it originated in the global South. First, actually, in post-colonial Latin America, and in recent years in the post-apartheid environment of South Africa. The Rhodes Must Fall student movement in 2015 originated at the University of Cape Town, and this called for the removal of the statues of Cecil Rhodes and contributed to a wider movement for the decolonization of education in South Africa. So what had been part of Latin American scholarship actually became alive, I think, through the instigation of South African students just 5 years ago. This movement spread to the UK and other countries, inspiring other movements like this to recognize the implicit and explicit ways that a country and even a university's history had benefited from or exploited certain groups in society, whether historically or also currently. The decoloniality movement in the United States actually intersects with the anti-slavery consciousness that has emerged on some campuses, reverberating with the Black Lives Matter movement and challenging the more familiar policy frames that we find in higher education, that of diversity and inclusion. So diversity and inclusion has become a little bit, I think, inadequate for incorporating both human rights, the human rights lens, this is what I'm arguing anyway, but also decoloniality. So decoloniality, by the way, it's a perspective, it's also a practice, it's a work in progress. There's no ready-made formulas for how to decolonize university campuses, but there are insights and experiences that can inform this iterative process. So I'd like to propose some questions because I myself don't know exactly how this might work, but I'm very actively studying and trying to learn through some practices. So what questions can we ask that incorporate both decoloniality and human rights in the frame I've just proposed, that of acceptability? One question: what is the degree to which access to higher education, non-discrimination, and quality education are processes of ongoing norm setting and implementation? How varied are the actors involved in these processes, both within the national contexts, but within specific universities as well? And these actors might include not only higher education policymakers, but students, politicians, civil society, and even the private sector. How are human rights laws and norms applied to national and local discourses on higher education around topics, for example, such as accessibility, affordability, non-discrimination, inclusion, and diversity? And how are such discourses influenced by socio-political, legal, and economic considerations? Those kinds of questions pertain to the university culture as a whole, and policies and practices, but there's a couple of other areas we can apply questions to as well. For example, scholarship, writing, and research methods. Human rights and decolonial approaches to higher education can touch upon research and scholarship carried out by faculty and students. Bearing in mind, of course, that scholars have free choice in the selection of research approaches and paradigms, the following considerations might still be kept in mind. Incorporation of research methods and processes that facilitate the subject's identification of study topics. In other words, that they have some voice in the topics that are chosen to be studied. The presentation of authentic voices and direct involvement of these so-called subjects in the research itself, for example, through ethnographic and action research approaches. Another consideration, assurance that the research carried out benefits the communities that are studied, taking into account principles of reciprocity and feedback. Recognition of and carrying out research that's informed by post-colonial and post-structural studies. Finally, aiming to carry out research that disrupts racist practices and attitudes, ethnocentric assumptions, and exploitive research. So directly aiming for research to fulfill that agenda. Teaching and learning practices. The UN standards on the right to education have highlighted the importance of delivering education in ways that are non-discriminatory. So that's a general principle. How can we think about that in terms of our teaching and learning practices? Pedagogy, or how teaching and learning is organized, is a central consideration for effective education. And one pedagogy that might be considered to be relevant is the pedagogy of inclusion. And I don't know if you've heard that phrase before, but there's such a thing. It's a frame for thinking about how pedagogy can promote inclusive education, meaning actively identifying and helping to overcome barriers that certain learners may have to learning. These barriers can be associated with membership in a vulnerable group, although membership in such a group may not be actually known to the educator themselves. But potential barriers to inclusion include a poor previous education, maybe having to do with coming from an impoverished background or a poor schooling system, a non-native speaker of the language that's being used in the university classroom, or a physical disability, illness, or condition that somehow impedes a student's being able to have access to classrooms, resources, or being able to participate at the same level of or speed as other students in the class. These are all potential barriers. So educators committed to human rights will actually actively seek out ways to identify practices that reflect equality and non-discrimination in how teaching is conducted in ways that are going to be inclusive. Instructors can remain aware of background features of the learner that either make them advantaged or disadvantaged in being able to succeed in the class. The educator might even think about his or her own expectations of students and make adjustments so that all learners can succeed in the classroom. A pedagogy of inclusion will likely result in the educator retaining high expectations for all students, but demonstrating flexibility in how teaching is carried out and how learning is demonstrated. In terms of decoloniality, there are very specific ideas about how teaching and learning practices might be improved upon, and especially curriculum and the actual structure of classes. So the following list that I'm going to share presents activities that might be undertaken by faculty, program, and departmental levels at those various levels for decoloniality. First, there could be the involvement of staff and students in efforts to diversify and decolonize courses and programs. For example, through identification of culturally and linguistically diverse sources. The co-construction of curriculum and knowledge by faculty with students, assuming also diversity in the student body. The critical review of the canon of a discipline and the subjects with addition of alternative core disciplinary tenets. In other words, taking into account that many of the disciplines that are being taught come from a Eurocentric or Western tradition, can we examine that critically and not throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, but to think about critically reflecting on those canons and disciplines and perhaps including not only those critiques, but other subjects from non-Western sources, maybe other canons. Review of the content of courses, including references to history, geography, and the humanities, with attention to who was excluded, who was marginalized, and directly addressing colonial education. So this implies obviously representation of a range of examples from both the Global South and the Global North in curriculum, and drawing on diverse sets of sources, including text, oral history, images, and other ways of knowing. And finally, enactment of equity grading to ensure the assessment of student learning is constructive, fair, and transparent. I just also want to acknowledge that the decoloniality framework also critiques the human rights framework itself. So even though I consider these approaches to be complementary, the decoloniality perspective is also critical of the human rights history. Its history being rooted in Western ways of knowing, in natural law, and human rights. The whole framework itself was established prior to decolonization, the decolonization movement internationally. So these critiques are well taken, and I think we also need to remain critical of the human rights framework with that legacy, and I encourage debate also on decoloniality, because I think we need to be open to debate. It's healthy and it's necessary. My fourth and final A for quality education is adaptability. Adaptability means that education is going to evolve with the changing needs of society. It should challenge inequalities such as gender discrimination. Education needs to adapt to locally specific needs and contexts. The human rights framework itself, whereas the decoloniality, by the way, I think reminds us to be looking back and looking historically at our ways of working and knowing in higher education. I think the human rights framework calls us to look at the present time and to look forward with thinking about social and political problems that need to be addressed. And I think specifically that human rights education helps to keep higher education relevant and dynamic in preparing students to tackle these issues. Now, my own background professionally is in human rights education for, through, and about human rights. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on human rights education now. The Declaration on Human Rights, Education, and Training, which was passed by the United Nations in 2011, so not that long ago, indicated that human rights education should use languages and methods suited to target groups, taking into account their specific needs and conditions. So this has to do with kind of, I think, what I just spoke about a little bit, this, being sensitive to, having pedagogically sensitive ways of working with students coming from different backgrounds. But I'd like to say more about human rights education. It has evolved as a standard within the International Human Rights Framework. There's now an ongoing and permanent world program for human rights education. And I've already mentioned the UN Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training. And the latter states very clearly that governments have an obligation to provide access to information about human rights. And from the UN point of view, this can be happening and should be happening at all levels of education, not only higher education, but also secondary education and primary education, as well as in the non-formal education sector. And the integration of human rights education within higher education, in my opinion anyway, should, on the one hand, include knowledge about relevant international and regional human rights standards. It should, secondly, be carried out in a way that reflects the core human rights values of equality and meaning and promoting human dignity for all. And ultimately, I think human rights education and higher education should result in learners being motivated to promote and protect human rights and to recognize that human rights is relevant for their daily lives. Now, I'm not here advocating that everyone has to become a human rights activist if they get exposed to human rights in higher education, not at all. But I think understanding the human rights system, seeing what the values are for human rights, thinking critically also about those values and how they relate to one's own values if you haven't been exposed to human rights earlier, how those relate to societies and how it helps maybe promote an agenda for improvement. Again, there's all kinds of ways in which university faculty and students can contribute to improving their societies through the work they do, as well as trying to potentially influence governments' behaviors and policies, which activists are sometimes doing. Thinking about human rights in higher education and education for human rights at universities, there's more and more human rights centers being established in universities. In fact, they've really blossomed in the last 20 years, and they now tend to be cross-disciplinary. Human rights centers at universities are now sometimes associated with minors, they're associated with majors. These centers bring in speakers, they identify faculty at the university teaching a course related to human rights. And they've also tried to promote these centers through the active faculty have tried to promote that more courses are being offered if not only through so-called human rights majors or minors, but also through individual courses offered in other majors and minors. In the past, before we had these interdisciplinary human rights centers, we saw human rights predominantly in the law schools. And in fact, that kind of in an interesting way reflects the evolution of human rights education internationally, because there was a time when if you studied human rights and it was pretty much just studying the laws, the international human rights legal standards. But now with the fusion of the popular education approach to human rights education, we understand that human rights education is for everyone, and that it should be not only about legal knowledge, but also understandings about human rights values, skills development, and a motivation for personal and social transformation. And actually, a key Latin American, the pedagogue Paulo Freire, was critical for bringing the popular education approach and critical pedagogy approach to human rights education. So human rights related content in higher education would, on the one hand, include basic human rights, basic information about how human rights apply to every person every day in society. There's also, I think, room for human rights content that's very specific to either a discipline a student might be studying, like psychology or history, or a profession that someone is studying, like to become a teacher or to become a social worker or psychologist or a police officer. So there's very specific content we can imagine aside from the sort of the basics, the fundamentals of the human rights system and how it works and what are human rights. Within the higher education, there's clear content that's going to be relevant for different disciplines or different professional trainings. I think that it's also worth mentioning that the pedagogy of learning human rights education is very important to keep in mind. And experiential learning, for example, through clinically oriented elements of courses and projects, lends themselves to human rights education just as a kind of critical reflection approach does as well, which, for example, critical reflection encourages the application of the human rights lens to one's personal life and society so that we can become more conscious of injustices and areas for change. So experiential learning, participatory approaches, critical reflection, that kind of praxis, I think is very core to human rights education in universities. And I do want to highlight that because if we think about human rights education and quality human rights education being that of motivation and internalization of human rights like values, then we need to be thinking about pedagogy and critical pedagogy. So that brings me to the conclusion of my presentation. I have, in summary, I have briefly touched on the international standards, the international human rights standards related to the right to education and non-discrimination that I think we can consider in relation to higher education. I've used the 4 A's of Tomaszewski to dive into ways of thinking about how human rights can apply to higher education in terms of accessibility, availability, adaptability, acceptability, but these are just frames. I hope that the content that I dug into in terms of teaching and learning processes and university culture and ways of working as a whole were sufficiently covered for your interests. I've also linked up with the D Coloniality Movement. I think that that's really relevant. Obviously, I think that human rights is relevant for higher education, but I understand that we're all of us, we've got questions about this, we've got that we can be exploring, we've got maybe some principles we can already be applying. I think there is lots of room for improvement, and I think the time is right to be doing this now as human rights are under pressure internationally. So thank you for your attention, and I very much look forward to your questions.